Welcome to The Buzz. I'm Christopher Conover. This week, what powers do states have at the border? Arizona is among a handful of states where the legislature is trying to take immigration or border enforcement out of federal hands and put it into state law. The rash of bills comes after years of political stalemate in Congress on reforms to border issues. But the issue goes back more than a decade with past efforts like Arizona's SB 1070 or California's Proposition 187. We start today's show with Lynn Marcus, a professor of law at the University of Arizona and clinic director at the James E. Rogers College of Law. She starts by telling us why states cannot enforce federal immigration law at the border.
Article 1 of the Constitution grants the Congress the power to establish, quote, a uniform rule of naturalization. And that's presumably because it would be chaos if individual states could set their own rules as to who's eligible for U.S. citizenship. But since the late 1800s, the courts have also found that the federal government has to be able to set and enforce immigration laws and policies generally because that's inherent in national sovereignty. National sovereignty means not only having control over the territory, but also being able to conduct foreign relations. And immigration impacts all aspects of foreign relations: trade, investment, tourism, diplomatic relations, how U.S. citizens are treated abroad. And so when you have a patchwork of policies on how immigration is regulated, that creates problems with foreign relations.
And that was really the crux of the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling that struck down SB 1070 more than a decade ago, Arizona's Show Me Your Papers law.
Yeah, I mean, the court in that case was looking at, how you draw the lines, looking at other, cases that have been drawing the lines over the years in terms of what states can and can't do. And they basically have three lines. They can't pass ordinances that regulate immigration, that determine who gets to come in or the conditions under which they can remain. And that's the exclusive domain of the federal government. For example, there was an ordinance in Texas that required landlords to review documents to determine immigration status before renting to someone. And the federal court found that that was an unlawful regulation of immigration because it would keep some legal residents from being able to rent. And the courts found that that was really a backdoor attempt to regulate immigration. And then second, the courts can't make rules where Congress has expressly what they call occupied the field. So with a scheme, that addresses whatever the problem is. And the prime examples there was in the case on SB 1070, Arizona versus United States. That was back in 2012. And that was because Arizona wanted to pass a law making it a crime for certain people to work without authorization. And Congress in 1986 had already looked at all the policies, made choices, passed a comprehensive scheme of employer sanctions, rather than worker sanctions. Third is the states and localities can't make rules that conflict with federal immigration laws. And I think a good example there is a new law in Texas that criminalizes illegal entry into the state and requires state judges to issue deportation orders. And the lawyers in that case recently argued in district court. And the judge said, look, I'm sympathetic to the state's concerns about the surge of migrants crossing the border and resources for the state, but state court judges are going to have to decide whether to follow state law, which doesn't have any provision for asylum and other kinds of defenses to deportation, or federal law, which does. Those are the three main rules that the courts have, sketched out. But of course, the state and local laws can't violate other laws either, like with the infamous Maricopa County Sheriff Joe Arpaio. Federal court found that, he and his deputies conducted race-based traffic stops and work raids, and, those violate the rights of immigrants and citizens as well.
You mentioned that Texas law where they said you cannot come into Texas without proper authorization, basically. and the courts are striking that down. I'm sure there are a number of other states that would like to try that, or if not states, members of legislatures and things like that. They might not get it past a governor. Is this a new idea that Texas is trying, or have other states tried this in the past and Texas is just hoping for a better, what they view as a better outcome legally?
I mean, no, it's definitely not, the first time. Justice Scalia was a dissenter in the SB 1070 case, and he pointed out, look, states having, control over who comes in and out of the state goes back to like before the founding of the United States, and the Constitution didn't expressly, take that away. So he's obviously got a different viewpoint. And in Texas, the state of Texas is clearly ready to take that on and run it up the flagpole to the Supreme Court and see if the outcome this time is different. But there were a rash of state laws and local ordinances in, I think it was basically the early 2000s, and there was really a concerted effort by immigration restrictionists and think tanks where they got together and drafted SB 1070, and there were 5 states with copycat laws. And so really, I think building up until the Supreme Court decided that Arizona versus United States case on SB 1070, there was just sort of an explosion and a concerted national effort to try to restrict immigration on state and local level.
When we go and look at the legal history of all of this and states not being allowed to enforce immigration laws, we also see things like Operation Stone Garden, where local law enforcement, be it police officers, sheriff's deputies, can help the Border Patrol out. Now it's state officers working with Border Patrol. How do they get around all of these rulings and the laws that say, no, this is federal, not state?
Well, there's a specific provision of the Immigration Nationality Act called 287G, and these states and counties, I think, enter into these 287G agreements where the Department of Homeland Security deputizes selected officials to perform certain functions of immigration agents, which is what happens with Operation Stone Garden. And there has to be some training and supervision by ICE. So those have been around for quite a while. And I believe that Biden said he was going to not enter into any new ones and basically stop doing that because there've been a lot of problems with them, including the racial profiling of Latinos that happened in Maricopa County with its 287G agreement at the time. And also with like fear and distrust of law enforcement that can happen, that can actually hinder public safety efforts and community policing. And I should mention, these agreements like Stone Garden can end up costing the counties a lot of money. Ironically, they get money in the short term, and then all the overtime pay leads to increase in pension costs that the local taxpayers foot the bills for. But that's, to get back to your original question, that's how there is this collaboration, because it's specifically authorized by, provisions in U.S. law, but also states can do things that don't conflict. They can require, for example, certain types of state benefits and resources only to be applied to people with lawful immigration status, as long as they're not making those determinations using their own laws and standards, and they're using like a federal database, a federal system.
State governors seem to have a lot of power when it comes to declarations of emergency. If Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California, Florida were to declare immigration emergencies somehow, would that give them any more power that wouldn't get them in trouble with the federal government to enforce their own immigration laws like that Texas law? Or is it very clear you can declare an emergency for a tornado or a hurricane or a flood, but you cannot declare one for immigration?
I mean, whatever, declaring an emergency doesn't get you around the court standards for what, states and localities are authorized to do and what crosses the line. So, I think, that's the bottom line.
All right. Well, thanks for spending some time with us and trying to clear up what is obviously, I won't say a murky part of law, but a complicated part of U.S. law.
If I can give my own 2 cents, Christopher,
Sure.
I think that, from my perspective, a lot of these efforts to enforce immigration laws on the local level are misguided. They tend to have backlash against the state, boycotts, and they don't always take into account, what happens if we actually get rid of a lot of immigrant workers that we need in our states. And so, like, what you're going to try to do is not politically grandstand and score points, but actually solve problems, it's going to have to be done on the national level with comprehensive solutions that look at like the mismatch of our visas and our employers' needs and root causes and the whole rash of things that these state provisions don't take into account.
That was University of Arizona law professor Lynn Marcus. After we spoke with her, a federal judge put Texas's new law on hold. That law would have allowed the state to enforce its own immigration laws. Now that we've heard what states can and can't do, we ask how they can help federal law enforcement at the border. Victor Manjarrez Jr. is a former chief Border Patrol agent for the U.S. Border Patrol's Tucson and El Paso sectors, and is the current director of the Center for Law and Human Behavior at the University of Texas, El Paso. I started by asking him how enforcing immigration law at the border is different from local law enforcement.
And that's a great question because, when you think of local police officer, either the city police, the sheriffs, or even the state troopers, they all have peace officer status. And whereas a federal law enforcement agent, as a border patrol agent, does not. And what that means is, police officer could cite you or arrest you for misdemeanor, anywhere from a misdemeanor to a felony. And for a border patrol agent, statutorily, they could arrest you for a felony in their presence of you. A great example, let's say they're at the 7-Eleven getting a cup of coffee, and there's an armed guy that comes in robbing the place. And he's watching it go down. He would technically have the arrest authority to arrest him for a felony. Now, of course, the arrest would come up, and the local law enforcement would be called, and they would hand that person over.
That's a big difference. It sounds like it's pretty small, but when you start thinking about that, and especially in the presence of you, they're not running off a report as the sheriff's office, the troopers, the local police officers can do.
It sure is, and I look at in my career in the Border Patrol, a good portion of that was in Southeast Arizona. There was a time in Cochise County where the sheriff's department had about a 3-hour window that they had no deputies on duty. When I was the agent in charge in Douglas, the Douglas station at the time, we had 600 Border Patrol agents. So we were the largest law enforcement entity in Cochise County. And so what often would happen was the 911 dispatch system would actually send the calls to the Douglas Border Patrol station during that time span. And we would dispatch a Border Patrol agent or two, whatever it took, in essence, to be en route while a Cochise County deputy is being called to head out. Let's say someone calls, it's perceived kind of a life and death situation. Hey, someone's breaking into my house, things of that nature. What you want to do is stop the threat. And so what it does by dispatching the Border Patrol agents, it gave the deputies time to get ready to go.
Right. So long as somebody with a badge and flashing lights is on the way, we can, get it stabilized until the local officials show up, type of thing.
Absolutely. Right. It's kind of like, I guess in easier terms, you're driving down I-10, you see a vehicle and parked on the side of the road. What do? The brake lights come on. And then you drive by and go, wow, there's no one in it. It's that idea of providing some kind of deterrence, some kind of perception of a consequence.
So talking about local law enforcement or even the National Guard, we hear often local law enforcement, National Guard being sent to the border. Right now it's going on out of state. Local officers being sent to Texas. National Guard has been sent to the Arizona border before and various other border crossings. Is that helpful to agents, or does it just really turn out to be more for show and the agents continue doing what they were doing.
It is not only helpful for the agents, but I think it's helpful generally, kind of the bigger purpose, right? So when you look at deployment of National Guard, the largest deployment of National Guard was during a time frame called Operation Jumpstart. And it was, I believe, 2006, 2007. There were 6,000 Border Patrol agents deployed to the southwest border. And so at that time, there was really close coordination between the Department of Homeland Security and the National Guard. Because you got to remember the National Guard, there's two funding mechanisms, right? I think it's, and forgive me if I got these incorrect, I think it's Title 10 and Title 32. One of them the governor pays for, and the other one the feds pay for. Under the federal deployment, it was much more coordinated effort. We had at our headquarters and said, okay, we're going to be sending National Guardsmen from Guam. Where do you need them at? We need them in Ajo, Arizona, right? And they'd be sent there. What kind of skill sets do you need? We need surveillance capabilities, not so much to do the interdiction, but eyes and ears to see what's going on to provide that platform, transportation services, mechanical service, things of that nature. Whereas what you're seeing now are the states that are deploying a National Guardsman. And so when you see National Guardsmen being deployed to Arizona and to Texas from other states, that coordination's happening within the state, but I'm not sure how tight that is actually with the Department of Homeland Security.
I remember, and you're right, it was around 2006 or so, Operation Jumpstart. There were Kansas National Guardsmen somewhere near Yuma, and they were building what we now know as the wall. And they were all amazed because it was summer and they were from Kansas and they had to be in their leathers for welding, and they could only work at night because it was so hot. Obviously something the Border Patrol wouldn't be doing, but as you mentioned, we've seen them act as mechanics and all kinds of other things. I guess the idea is to free up sworn agents, Border Patrol agents, to go and work on interdiction and let somebody else handle the office and the back of house support stuff.
That's absolutely correct. When we see a Border Patrol agent out in the field, what we don't see is the logistical requirement that's behind, right? And that logistical requirement may be everything from transportation to someone watching and caring for detainees, someone processing the detainees, someone feeding the detainees. If they're criminal by nature and they're being prosecuted, who's running them to the U.S. Marshal's office, right, for detention to be presented. It's a really long and large logistical tail. And so when you have National Guardsmen that come out and are deployed in those type of activities, it relieves a Border Patrol agent that was doing it. And puts them back out in the field. And so that is the very big benefit. Certainly was a big benefit for Operation Jumpstart.
If you were in charge of the border for a day?
No, thank you.
Understandable. We'll keep it a hypothetical. We won't put your name in for that. But someone came to you and said, you can have the state resources that you need. What would you tell them the Border Patrol needs the states to do? Maybe it's not people. It might not be sending officers. It might be something else. What would you tell them the states need to do to help the Border Patrol?
Well, if it wasn't officers and if it wasn't National Guardsmen, what I have found in my career is that if you can deliver a consequence to the act of entering the country illegally, it has a really big effect. And it doesn't even have to be 100% consequence across the board. What I had found, it would range anywhere from 20 to 30% of the population. If you deliver a consequence, that had a detrimental effect or a kind of a chilling effect of kind of turning a spigot off of the flows. And that consequence could be a formal deportation. It could be a criminal prosecution for smuggling. It could be moved to return voluntary to a different part of the southern border. Anything to break up that smuggling ring, and any prosecution that the state could pick up. For example, narcotics violations. There was a time in the 2000s that the district attorney for the state of Arizona would not prosecute a marijuana case if it was under 500 pounds. So if you had 499 pounds, they wouldn't prosecute at the federal level. And so what we ended up doing was going to the state and counties level. And it was great because they never said no. The problem, though, is we taxed our resources. The states would come up and say, man, could you beef up some of your prosecution units? Could you beef up those type of things? Or even temporarily, can you bring them from other counties that maybe are at a slower pace? Because you'd have enough of a consequence to actually start to turn off that flow that's coming across right now.
It sounds like you would also be in favor of what is known as Operation Stone Garden, where local law enforcement helps with patrols in certain areas, and their traffic stops can be used as a pretext to check someone's immigration status.
Yes, I've always been a fan of Stone Garden, provided that the states or the local entities work with the department. It really serves the Border Patrol no good if you have the state or local entities kind of doing their own thing. Really has to be a coordinated effort. I would often tell my staff in Tucson when I would hear the briefings, they'd be talking about collaborating. The little hair in the back of my neck would go up on that because I didn't want to hear collaborating. Collaborating to me was just a lot of talk over coffee and nothing getting accomplished. What I wanted to hear was that we were coordinating. We were integrating our resources. For example, if a place, let's say in Cochise County, and you're focused near Douglas and Agua Prieta, or that area between Douglas and Naco, and you can't get to the eastern part, but you've got Cochise sheriff's deputies that are in their 6-day overtime could patrol the road. Their own jurisdiction, not immigration, but their own jurisdiction, because from a distance, all you see is a law enforcement officer. You don't know if it's a deputy, you don't know if it's a Border Patrol agent, and that provides a huge value.
It sounds like communication is key, and communication up front. Don't just have Kansas send National Guard troops to the border and tell the governor, but you should call the Border Patrol first, and communication is key.
It really is. If you're going to have a party, you might as well organize it a little bit, right?
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome.
That was Victor Manjarrez Jr., former Chief Patrol Agent for the U.S. Border Patrol's El Paso and Tucson sectors. And that's the buzz for this week. You can find all our episodes online at azpm.org and subscribe to our show wherever you get your podcast. Just search for The Buzz Arizona. We're also on the NPR app. Zach Ziegler is our producer, and our music is by Enter the Haggis. I'm Christopher Conover. Thanks for listening.
Arizona Public Media's original programming is made possible in part by the Community Service Grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.